In 1892, a 22-year-old anarchist walked into Henry Clay Frick's Pittsburgh office. Alexander Berkman carried a revolver and a sharpened file. He had come to kill the most hated man in industrial America. Berkman fired twice. Both bullets hit Frick. He stabbed repeatedly with the file. Frick fought back. Office workers subdued the attacker. Blood covered the floor. The wounds were serious, potentially fatal. Frick refused to leave for the hospital until the day's work was complete. He had the bullets removed in the office. The wounds were stitched. He finished reviewing contracts. The next morning, he returned to his desk. The assassination attempt failed, but it succeeded in ways Alexander Berkman never intended. The attack taught Henry Clay Frick something that would shape the rest of his life. Flesh was vulnerable. Buildings were not. Over the next 27 years, Frick would construct 3 major residences. Each was more sophisticated than the last. Each incorporated security features that became increasingly invisible. And one would outlast almost every other Gilded Age mansion in America, transforming from a fortress designed to protect one man into a museum that would preserve his name for centuries. This is not a simple story about wealth and architecture. This is about how violence shaped building design, how fear drove artistic ambition, and how a man who survived death created something that would survive long after every memory of that July morning had faded. The mansions Henry Clay Frick built were his answer to mortality. The question is whether they succeeded. The man worth killing. Henry Clay Frick was born in 1849 in western Pennsylvania. His family had no money. His formal education ended at 17. Nothing suggested he would become wealthy enough that someone would want him dead. At 21, Frick borrowed money and entered the coke business. Coke was processed coal, essential for steel production. Pittsburgh was becoming the steel capital of America. Frick positioned himself at the intersection of supply and demand. By his mid-20s, Frick had become a millionaire. Not through innovation, but through ruthless efficiency. He bought out competitors. He undercut prices until rivals failed. He built a monopoly that controlled nearly 80% of the coke supplied to Pittsburgh's steel mills. The coke ovens that generated Frick's wealth operated 24 hours a day. Workers died regularly in conditions that would horrify modern observers. Frick saw this as the cost of progress. The strong survived, the weak did not. In 1881, Andrew Carnegie noticed Frick's operation. Carnegie needed coke. Frick controlled coke. Carnegie bought a stake in Frick's business. Frick became a partner in Carnegie Steel Company and eventually its chairman. The partnership made both men extraordinarily wealthy. Carnegie provided vision and public relations. Frick provided operational brutality. Where Carnegie wrote essays about the responsibilities of wealth, Frick accumulated it. Where Carnegie worried about his legacy, Frick worried about his margins. By 1890, Frick's annual income exceeded $1 million. In today's terms, well over $30 million. He was 39 years old and already thinking about what men of his position were expected to build. But Frick's wealth came with enemies. The workers in his coke ovens hated him. The competitors he had destroyed hated him. And in 1892, the workforce at one of Carnegie Steel's largest facilities would give him a reason to be hated by millions more. The Homestead Steel Mill sat outside Pittsburgh on the Monongahela River. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers represented the skilled workers there. The union was one of the most powerful in America. In June 1892, their contract was set to expire. Frick had no intention of negotiating. He would break the union. He built a fence around the Homestead plant, 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire. Watchtowers at the corners, searchlights. The workers called it Fort Frick. The message was clear. The mill would operate with or without them. On July 6, 1892, Frick sent 300 Pinkerton guards up the river on barges. Their orders were to take control of the plant. The workers were waiting on the shore, armed. What followed was a battle that lasted all day, guns on both sides. Workers fired from the shore. Pinkertons fired from the barges. By the time it ended, 10 men were dead. Dozens more wounded. The Pinkertons surrendered. The Pennsylvania militia arrived days later to enforce Frick's authority. The strike was broken, the Union destroyed, and Henry Clay Frick became the most hated man in industrial America. Newspapers across the country condemned the violence. Editorials called Frick a murderer. Political cartoons depicted him as a tyrant standing on workers' corpses. Death threats arrived daily at his office. Frick ignored them all. He had won. The mill operated without union labor. Costs dropped. Profits increased. From Frick's perspective, the violence at Homestead proved his approach was correct. Break resistance decisively, and resistance stops. 2 weeks later, Alexander Berkman came to collect the debt Frick believed he did not owe. Berkman was a Russian immigrant, an anarchist who believed that killing industrial tyrants would spark revolution. He had read about Homestead. He decided Frick deserved to die. On July 23, 1892, he traveled to Pittsburgh to deliver that judgment. July 23rd, the attempt. Alexander Berkman entered the Chronicle Telegraph Building in downtown Pittsburgh shortly after 2 in the afternoon. He took the elevator to the second floor. The Carnegie Steel Company offices occupied most of that level. Berkman told the receptionist he was an agent from New York with business to discuss with Mr. Frick. The receptionist showed him to Frick's private office. Henry Clay Frick was meeting with John Leishman, the vice chairman of Carnegie Steel. Berkman walked through the door. He pulled a revolver from his coat. He fired. The first bullet hit Frick in the neck. The second struck his back near the shoulder blade. Frick stood up from his desk. Leishman grabbed Berkman's arm. Frick, bleeding, fought back. The 3 men struggled. Berkman dropped the revolver. He pulled out the sharpened file. He stabbed Frick repeatedly in the legs and torso. Frick continued fighting. Office workers rushed in. They subdued Berkman and held him on the floor. A carpenter working in the building heard the commotion. He entered the office with a hammer. He struck Berkman twice in the head before others stopped him. Blood covered the office floor. 2 men were seriously wounded. One was the attacker. The other refused to leave. Frick sat back down at his desk. He called for a doctor to remove the bullets, but insisted the day's work be completed first. A physician arrived and extracted 1 bullet from Frick's neck. The second bullet, lodged near his spine, was too dangerous to remove immediately. The doctor stitched the stab wounds. While the doctor worked, Frick continued reviewing contracts. He signed documents. He gave instructions to staff. He refused morphine, saying he needed to remain clear-headed. The entire time, Berkman was held in the outer office, awaiting police. After nearly 2 hours, Frick allowed himself to be taken home. The next morning, he returned to work. The bullet remained in his back. It would stay there for the rest of his life. The newspapers reported the attack as front-page news across the country. Public reaction was complex. Many who had condemned Frick for Homestead were horrified by the assassination attempt. Violence against workers was one thing. Political assassination was another. Berkman's action backfired catastrophically. Instead of sparking revolution, it generated sympathy for Frick. Labor leaders who had supported the Homestead strike now distanced themselves from any association with anarchist violence. Frick emerged from the attack with his reputation paradoxically enhanced. But something changed in Frick himself. He had always been cautious. Now he became vigilant. He had always valued security. Now he understood it as essential. A man attacked in his own office learns that safety is not a given. It must be built. Berkman was sentenced to 22 years in prison. He served 14 before being released. He never expressed regret for the attempt, only disappointment that he had failed. Years later, he would write that killing Frick might have changed American labor history. He was probably wrong. But his failure changed Frick's architectural history. The assassination attempt taught Frick 3 lessons that would shape every building he constructed for the rest of his life. First, walls matter. The office where he was attacked had a door anyone could walk through. His future homes would not. Second, distance provides protection. Pittsburgh was full of men who wanted him dead. Building elsewhere became not just desirable, but necessary. Third, permanence outlasts enemies. Flesh could be stabbed and shot. Stone could not. If Frick wanted to be remembered as something other than the man who broke Homestead, he needed to build monuments that would stand after everyone who hated him was gone. Within months of the assassination attempt, Frick began planning his first major residence, not in downtown Pittsburgh, where violence had found him. In the city's wealthiest neighborhood, on a plot large enough for gardens and walls and distance from anyone who might walk through a door carrying a gun. The house would be called Clayton, and it would be built like a fortress. Building Clayton, Pittsburgh's fortress. In 1892, the same year Alexander Berkman tried to kill him, Henry Clay Frick purchased property at 5700 Penn Avenue in Pittsburgh's East End. The location was deliberate. Penn Avenue was where Pittsburgh's wealthiest families built their homes. The address announced arrival, but timing mattered more than location. Frick bought the land after the assassination attempt, after understanding, viscerally, that his life was in danger. Clayton would be his architectural response to violence. Frick hired Frederick John Osterling, a Pittsburgh architect known for Richardsonian Romanesque designs. The style was perfect for Frick's needs. Richardsonian Romanesque meant heavy stone construction, rounded arches, towers, the aesthetic of fortresses applied to domestic architecture. Clayton rose on Penn Avenue as a statement of permanence. The exterior was Indiana limestone and brick, not painted wood that would require maintenance, not materials that suggested temporary wealth, stone that would outlast everyone who lived nearby. The house contained 23 rooms across 4 floors, substantial but not excessive by Gilded Age standards. The Vanderbilts were building homes with 70 rooms. Frick wanted respect, not spectacle, but Clayton was more than its room count. The house incorporated security features unusual for a residence. Ground floor windows were smaller than typical for the era, positioned higher, not obvious enough to look fortified, obvious enough to matter. The walls were exceptionally thick, far beyond what structural requirements demanded. The main entrance could be secured quickly with locks designed for banks, not homes. These were not details most visitors would notice. Frick noticed. The first floor established the house's public purpose. A reception hall greeted visitors with dark wood paneling and a grand staircase. The library came next, lined with bookcases that suggested cultivation. The dining room could seat 24, sufficient for the social obligations required of men at Frick's level. The second floor was family space, Henry and Adelaide's bedrooms, rooms for their children, a sitting room where Adelaide managed household affairs, and the social calendar that was becoming increasingly important to Frick's broader ambitions. Adelaide Howard Childs had married Frick in 1882. She came from a prominent Pittsburgh family. She understood the social world Frick wanted to enter. Her influence on Clayton was significant. While Frick cared about architecture as statement, Adelaide cared about architecture as livability. The Fricks had 4 children, though only 2 survived to adulthood. Martha died in 1891 at age 6. Henry Clay Frick Jr. died in 1898 at age 4. The losses devastated both parents and gave Clayton's domestic spaces a grief that contrasted with its public grandeur. The third floor housed servants and additional guest rooms. The fourth floor, tucked into the tower, provided private space away from both family and staff. Frick used this as a retreat, a place to conduct business he preferred to keep from even his closest associates. The grounds around Clayton covered nearly 2 acres. Frick hired landscape architects to create formal gardens and walking paths. A greenhouse produced flowers year-round. The greenhouse was not merely decorative, it gave Adelaide a space she could control completely. But the landscape also served Frick's security concerns. The property created distance between the house and the street. The gardens meant anyone approaching the residence would be visible. Natural surveillance built into elegant design. Clayton was completed by 1895. The cost exceeded $500,000, equivalent to roughly $17 million today. For Pittsburgh, this was substantial. For Frick, this was the beginning. The house proved that Frick understood quality construction and appropriate design. Pittsburgh society could not dismiss him as uncultured new money. The architecture would not allow it. But Clayton also revealed Frick's limitations. Pittsburgh would always see him as the man who broke Homestead. The assassination attempt had occurred in a Pittsburgh office. The strike had played out in Pittsburgh newspapers. No amount of architectural sophistication could erase that. Frick began to understand that if he wanted to be remembered differently, he needed to build where his reputation could be written fresh, where architecture could define him before history did. Newport was the logical next step. Every major industrialist maintained a summer residence there. The concentration of Gilded Age wealth in one small Rhode Island town made it essential for anyone with serious social ambitions. Clayton had taught Frick what he wanted in his next residence: more privacy, more security, more control over who entered his space. Pittsburgh had given him his fortune. Clayton had given him his first architectural statement. But neither could give him what he increasingly wanted: a place where his past did not follow him through every door. Where the name Frick meant architecture and art, not homestead and assassination attempts. He would build that place in Newport and eventually in New York. The enemies list. Why he needed distance. Alexander Berkman went to prison. The bullet remained in Frick's back, but the threat did not end. Death threats arrived at Frick's office weekly throughout the 1890s. Letters promising bombs. Promises of another assassination attempt. Anonymous warnings that his wife and children would be targeted. Frick kept the most explicit threats in a locked drawer. He never spoke about them publicly. The Homestead strike had created enemies Frick would never outlive. Labor organizers who had watched their unions destroyed. Workers who had lost jobs and could not feed their families. Anarchists who saw Frick as the perfect symbol of capitalist brutality. The list was long and growing. Pittsburgh became uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with business. Frick could not walk downtown without security. His children could not play outside Clayton's walls without supervision. Adelaide feared leaving the house for social calls. The assassination attempt had changed daily life permanently. Frick's relationship with Andrew Carnegie collapsed completely after Homestead. Carnegie had been in Scotland during the strike. He claimed ignorance of Frick's tactics. Publicly, Carnegie distanced himself from the violence. Privately, he enjoyed the profits that came from breaking the Union. Frick never forgave the betrayal. Carnegie had given him authority to manage the mills. When that management became controversial, Carnegie abandoned him. The partnership would continue legally for another 8 years, but the personal relationship was finished. In 1899, Carnegie and Frick's feud became public. Disagreements over company valuations and partnership terms exploded into litigation. Carnegie tried to force Frick out of the steel company. Frick fought back. The legal battle was vicious and personal. The dispute was eventually settled out of court. Frick received millions in compensation, but the experience taught him another lesson about permanence. Business partnerships failed. Personal relationships ended. Buildings did not. Eagle Rock, the guarded paradise. The property Frick purchased in Newport sat in Pride's Crossing, slightly removed from the most concentrated mansion district along Bellevue Avenue. The separation was intentional. Frick valued proximity to Newport society, but preferred it at a distance. He hired Peabody and Stearns, a Boston architectural firm with an impressive Newport portfolio. They had designed estates for the Vanderbilts and Whitneys. Their style combined English country house aesthetics with American scale. This was exactly what Frick wanted, elegance without European pretension. The house rose in shingle style, a popular choice for Newport that suggested informal sophistication. Shingle facades covered structures built with the same attention to quality that had defined Clayton. Superior materials, thick walls, details that would last centuries. The estate contained between 30 and 40 rooms, though exact counts vary in historical records. The ambiguity reflects Frick's approach, substantial without being the largest on the island. The Vanderbilt houses had more rooms. Frick wanted something different, something that felt like a residence, not a hotel. But the genius of Eagle Rock was not in the house itself. It was in the landscape. Over 10 acres surrounded the mansion. Formal gardens near the house transitioned to more natural landscaping toward the property's edges. Walking paths wound through carefully planned plantings. The effect appeared effortless. The reality was intensive design. Every element served a security purpose Frick never articulated publicly. The landscape created clear sightlines from the house to the property boundaries. Anyone approaching could be seen long before they reached the residence. Natural surveillance disguised as landscape beauty. The distance from neighboring properties was the estate's most critical feature. Unlike the crowded Bellevue Avenue mansions where properties touched, Eagle Rock sat isolated. Visitors arrived by a long drive that gave staff time to identify who was coming. Frick had learned from Clayton that walls and towers announced defensiveness. Eagle Rock proved that distance could provide better security without looking like security at all. The estate felt open and welcoming. It was actually controlled and monitored more carefully than any fortress. The first floor contained spaces designed for Newport's social requirements. A large entrance hall provided access to principal rooms. The living room could accommodate several dozen guests. The dining room seated 20. These were performance spaces for the social obligations that justified the estate's existence. Frick's library at Eagle Rock functioned as a working space, unlike Clayton's display library. Telegraph access kept him connected to Pittsburgh and New York. Business continued even during summer months. Adelaide's influence at Eagle Rock was profound. She managed the household staff, directed the social calendar, and orchestrated the complex dance of Newport society. The estate's staff during summer months exceeded 20 people. Running Eagle Rock was a logistics operation Adelaide managed with precision. Newport's summer season ran from June through September. During those months, Eagle Rock operated as the Frick family's primary residence. The estate gave Frick's surviving children, Helen and Childs, a place to spend summers away from Pittsburgh. Both developed attachments to Newport that lasted their entire lives. The deaths of Martha and Henry Jr. had made security more urgent for Frick. He was not just protecting himself anymore. He was protecting what remained of his family. Eagle Rock's isolation provided that protection without making his children feel imprisoned. During the 18 years Frick owned Eagle Rock, Newport evolved from a collection of summer cottages to a competition in architectural excess. The Breakers, Marble House, Rosecliff. Frick watched this evolution with interest, but did not participate in the escalation. Eagle Rock was sufficient for his purposes. But Newport was seasonal. 4 months of safety, 8 months elsewhere. By 1910, Frick was spending less time at Eagle Rock. Business kept him in New York more frequently. His art collection was growing beyond what the Newport house could display properly. Frick began to understand that Newport was a stepping stone, not a destination. The families who truly mattered spent winters in New York. That was where power concentrated. That was where Frick needed to establish himself permanently. Eagle Rock had taught him critical lessons about architectural security. Distance worked better than walls. Landscape could provide protection without announcing defensiveness. And a house that appeared welcoming could still be completely controlled. These lessons would shape his final and most ambitious residence. The Manhattan Mansion, designed from the beginning not just to protect him during his lifetime, but to preserve his name for centuries after his death. In 1917, Frick sold Eagle Rock. The estate had served its purpose. He was ready to focus entirely on New York and the legacy he would build there. Planning 1 East 70th, the final fortress. By 1912, Henry Clay Frick had decided his architectural legacy would be written in New York City. He was 63 years old. His fortune exceeded $100 million, and he wanted to build something that would outlast every temporary structure the Vanderbilts and Astors had erected. Frick had been considering a major New York residence for nearly a decade. He rented mansions on Fifth Avenue while searching for the right property. Location mattered enormously. The address needed to announce importance while providing enough land for the scale of house Frick envisioned. In 1913, Frick purchased the entire block front on Fifth Avenue between 71st and 72nd Streets. The property faced Central Park directly. The plot measured 150 feet on Fifth Avenue, 200 feet deep, The cost was $2,450,000, equivalent to roughly $75 million today, just for the land. The location was strategically perfect, far enough uptown to avoid the commercial encroachment destroying earlier Fifth Avenue mansions, close enough to the established wealth of the 60s and 70s to matter socially, and directly across from Central Park, which meant southern views could never be blocked by future construction. Frick knew exactly what he did not want. Not a French chateau like the Vanderbilt houses that were already looking dated. Not ostentatious display that would be dismissed as nouveau riche excess. And not anything that could not be converted eventually into a public institution. This last point shaped every decision that followed. Frick had been thinking about legacy in increasingly specific terms. Andrew Carnegie was spending his final years building libraries with his name on them. Frick had watched with interest, but Frick's ego demanded something different. Not his name on 100 buildings. His name on one perfect building. The mansion on 70th Street would be designed from the beginning to become a museum after his death. Not immediately. Adelaide would live there as long as she wanted, but eventually the house would open to the public. Frick would be remembered not as the man who broke Homestead, but as the man who gave New York one of its greatest cultural institutions. For this vision to work, the architecture had to be exceptional. Museum quality in every detail, built to last centuries, not decades, and designed with enough flexibility that conversion from residence to public gallery would be seamless. Frick interviewed several architectural firms before selecting Carrere and Hastings. The firm had designed the New York Public Library, one of the most acclaimed Beaux-Arts buildings in America. Their reputation was exactly what Frick needed: serious, classical, permanent. Thomas Hastings took the lead on the Frick project. Hastings understood immediately what Frick wanted: a residence that looked like it had always existed and always would. No architectural fads. No details that would date the building. Pure Beaux-Arts classicism executed at the highest level. The design process took over a year. Hastings proposed a limestone mansion in French neoclassical style, 3 stories visible from the street, a 4th story set back behind a balustrade. The proportions were carefully calculated to balance monumentality with residential scale. This was a home, not a government building. The distinction mattered. Frick insisted on specific features: a picture gallery that could display his art collection properly, a library that would function as both private retreat and future public reading room, a garden court that would bring natural light into the building's center, and security throughout that was sophisticated but invisible. The security requirements reflected everything Frick had learned since the assassination attempt. The building needed to be defensible without looking defended, strong enough to protect priceless art, secure enough to prevent another Alexander Berkman from walking through a door with a weapon. But unlike Clayton's obvious fortification or Eagle Rock's protective distance, the Fifth Avenue mansion would achieve security through superior construction and invisible systems. The fortress would be disguised as a palace. The budget was essentially unlimited. Frick told Hastings to design the building correctly, and cost would follow. Final construction estimates suggested over $5 million, equivalent to roughly $150 million today. Frick approved without hesitation. Building on Fifth Avenue in 1913 required navigating complex zoning regulations and neighbor objections. Frick approached these obstacles the same way he had approached labor disputes, with absolute determination and sufficient resources to eliminate opposition. Objections were bought off or bulldozed. Regulations were followed or worked around. Nothing would prevent this building from being constructed exactly as designed. Adelaide was consulted throughout planning, but had less influence than she had exercised at Clayton or Eagle Rock. This was Henry's project, his vision, his legacy. She understood that, and focused on ensuring the private spaces would be livable. The public rooms could be as grand as Henry wanted. The family quarters needed to function as an actual home. By late 1913, designs were final. Hastings had produced drawings that satisfied Frick's ambitions completely. The mansion would be classical without being cold, monumental without being oppressive, and permanent in ways that would outlast every other Gilded Age residence in New York. Construction was scheduled to begin in early 1914. Frick estimated 2 to 3 years to complete. He was impatient, but willing to wait for quality. This building had to be perfect. 21 years had passed since Alexander Berkman had walked into his Pittsburgh office. 2 decades since Frick had understood that his life was in danger and his reputation was beyond repair. The Fifth Avenue mansion would be his answer to both problems. Buildings lasted. Reputations changed. If you built something beautiful enough, eventually people would forget why they hated you. Or if they did not forget, at least they would walk through your doors to see great art in perfect rooms. Frick was betting his entire legacy on that assumption. 1 East 70th Street would prove whether he was right. Building the ultimate defense. Construction began on Frick's Fifth Avenue mansion in April 1914. Within months, World War I would start in Europe. The Gilded Age was ending, though few recognized it yet. Frick was building one of the last great private palaces in an era that would soon view such structures as monuments to excess. Thomas Hastings designed the exterior as pure French neoclassical. Indiana limestone formed the facade. Every block was cut to precise specifications. Every joint was invisible. The effect was a building that appeared carved from a single piece of stone rather than assembled from thousands. The mansion stretched 140 feet along Fifth Avenue, 76 feet deep, 3 primary floors plus a recessed 4th floor behind a stone balustrade. The height was calculated to balance presence with elegance, tall enough to command attention, restrained enough to avoid chateau excess. The entrance sat precisely at the center of the Fifth Avenue facade, a single door, flanked by columns and topped with a carved limestone pediment. Not the grand porte cochere many mansions featured. One door, the message, invitation only. Hastings used classical elements throughout, but avoided archaeological literalism. The columns were Doric in inspiration, but proportioned for the building's specific needs. The windows were tall rectangles with subtle surrounds. The roofline was clean, broken only by chimneys set back from view. Frick hired the George A. Fuller Company, one of New York's premier builders. Fuller had constructed the Flatiron Building and dozens of major projects. Their reputation for quality matched Hastings's architectural ambitions. The foundation went down 30 feet, far deeper than typical for residential construction. Frick wanted structural permanence that would last centuries. The basement included storage for art, wine cellars, mechanical systems, and staff spaces. Nothing was left to chance. The steel frame that supported the mansion was over-engineered deliberately. The building could have been constructed with lighter materials, but Frick insisted on structural capacity that exceeded any residential requirement. He was not building for his lifetime alone. The limestone blocks came from Indiana quarries specifically selected for color consistency. Each block was inspected before installation. Flawed pieces were rejected regardless of cost. The Fuller Company estimated that 15% of the limestone was rejected during construction, an extraordinarily high rate that reflected Frick's absolute insistence on perfection. But the real sophistication was in the security features, all invisible from outside. The windows were custom manufactured in France. Bronze frames, not wood. Triple glazed in some locations for sound dampening. The glass was optical quality, free of distortions. Frick wanted perfect transparency looking toward Central Park and perfect protection from Fifth Avenue noise. More importantly, bronze frames could not be forced like wood. The windows were defensible without appearing fortified. The doors were solid bronze, not wood with bronze facing. Each weighed hundreds of pounds. The locks came from Yale and Town, designed for banks rather than homes. The entire building could be secured within minutes if necessary. Ground floor windows were smaller than they appeared, set into deeper reveals that made forced entry difficult. The technique was subtle. Most visitors would never notice. But the defensive advantage was significant. Throughout the mansion, Frick had multiple safes installed. Some were visible in obvious locations. Others were hidden behind panels or built into walls. His experience with theft and the constant fear of fire made him obsessive about protecting his collection. The roof incorporated copper, not slate or tile. Copper would patina to green over time, which Hastings calculated would complement the limestone beautifully. More importantly, copper required virtually no maintenance and would outlast any other material. Hastings paid extraordinary attention to proportions. Classical architecture depends on mathematical relationships between elements. The height of the columns, the spacing of windows, the width of the entrance. Every measurement was calculated to create harmony. The facade was not decorated with ornament. It was structured through proportion. This restraint distinguished Frick's mansion from the Vanderbilt houses that had dominated Fifth Avenue for decades. The Vanderbilt mansions were spectacular in their excess. Carved limestone, elaborate ironwork, French chateau details layered until the buildings became architectural jewelry boxes. Frick's mansion was the opposite, calm, assured, classical in the sense that nothing could be added or removed without damaging the whole. Hastings had created architecture that looked simple, but required extraordinary sophistication to execute. The side facades on 70th and 71st Streets received nearly as much attention as the Fifth Avenue front. The limestone continued around all sides. This was not a false front, with cheaper construction hidden behind. The entire building was designed to the same standard. The garden on the 70th Street side was planned from the beginning. A private outdoor space in Manhattan was extraordinarily rare. The garden would provide natural light to interior rooms and create a buffer from adjacent properties. The wall separating the garden from the street was limestone matching the house, topped with bronze railings. By late 1915, the exterior was largely complete. The mansion rose on Fifth Avenue as Hastings had envisioned. Elegant, permanent, and utterly confident. Architectural critics praised its restraint and classical proportions, but the exterior was merely the frame. The interior would take another 2 years to complete, and that was where Frick's true ambitions would become clear. This was not just a house. It was a gallery designed to display one of the greatest private art collections in America. The challenge was creating spaces that functioned as both residence and museum. Rooms needed to feel comfortable for family life while being formal enough to display Rembrandts and Vermeers. The balance was delicate. Frick supervised construction personally. He visited the site regularly, inspecting work and demanding corrections when anything failed to meet his standards. The Fuller Company quickly learned that Frick would accept nothing less than perfection. By early 1917, the exterior was complete, and interior work was accelerating. Frick was 77 years old. He wanted to live in the house while he still could. The construction timeline was compressed as much as quality would allow. The mansion represented more than wealth or taste. It represented Frick's fundamental belief that architecture could rewrite history. The violence of Homestead, the assassination attempt, the decades of public hatred. All of it could be answered with a building so beautiful that eventually no one would remember why they had hated him. It was an audacious theory, and the mansion at 1 East 70th Street would test whether it was true. The building was completed in late 1919. The cost exceeded $5 million for construction, not counting the land. In total, Frick had invested roughly $7,500,000, equivalent to well over $200 million today. He moved in during November. He had 2 months to enjoy what he had built. Henry Clay Frick died on December 2, 1919. Adelaide's Choice: Converting Defense to Legacy. When Henry Clay Frick died in December 1919, he left explicit instructions in his will. The mansion at 1 East 70th Street would eventually become a public museum, but not immediately. His widow Adelaide would live there as long as she chose. Only after her death would the house open to the public. Adelaide was 61 when Henry died. She would live another 12 years in the mansion, maintaining it exactly as her husband had left it. The paintings remained on the walls. The furniture stayed in place. The house functioned as it had when Henry was alive. Except now Adelaide lived there alone. Those 12 years were critical for the mansion's future. Adelaide could have sold the house. She could have broken up the collection. She could have ignored Henry's wishes entirely. The will gave her that power, But Adelaide understood what Henry had built. She honored his vision. In 1921, Adelaide made the first significant change to the mansion. She commissioned John Russell Pope, one of America's leading architects, to design an addition. The addition would enclose the garden court that Hastings had planned but never completed. Pope created a glass-roofed courtyard that brought natural light into the center of the building while creating one of the mansion's most beautiful spaces. The garden court became the heart of the transformed museum. Pope designed it with classical proportions that complemented Hastings' original work perfectly. Columns surrounded a central fountain. Plants and flowers created a living garden inside the mansion. The space provided both beauty and function, serving as a transition point between gallery spaces. Pope also designed a new reception hall and made modifications to several rooms to improve traffic flow for visitors. These changes were subtle but essential. A private residence and a public museum have different circulation requirements. Pope's work allowed the mansion to function as both without compromising the architecture Hastings had created. Adelaide lived to see these modifications completed. She approved every detail, ensuring that changes enhanced rather than contradicted Henry's original vision. Her involvement guaranteed that the transformation from residence to museum would be seamless. The irony was profound. The fortress Henry had built to protect himself from violence would become a gift to the public he had spent his life keeping at a distance. The thick walls he had designed for defense would now provide climate control for paintings. The bronze doors meant to secure against intruders would protect Vermeers and Rembrandts. Adelaide understood this transformation better than Henry perhaps had. She saw that the defensive features he had obsessed over made the building perfect for its future purpose. The security systems that might have stopped another Alexander Berkman would now guard some of the world's greatest art. She also understood something else. The mansion's residential character was its greatest asset. Converting it to a museum did not require destroying what Henry had created. It required preserving it exactly as it was. The second-floor private quarters would become offices and storage. But the first-floor galleries would remain essentially unchanged. Visitors would walk through rooms where the Frick family had actually lived. They would see art displayed in the domestic setting for which it had been acquired. This was different from every other major museum in New York. The Metropolitan was encyclopedic and overwhelming. The mansion would be intimate and personal. That distinction would make it special. Adelaide Howard Childs Frick died in October 1931. She was 73 years old. Her death triggered the final phase of the mansion's transformation. The trustees of Frick's estate faced enormous challenges. The Great Depression had begun in 1929. Millions were unemployed. Museums were struggling. Opening an institution dedicated to displaying the treasures of a robber baron seemed tone-deaf at best, but the trustees proceeded. Frick's will had provided an endowment to support the museum. The endowment was sufficient to cover operations even during the Depression. And there was growing recognition that preserving great art collections served the public good, regardless of how those collections had been assembled. The transformation required relatively modest physical changes. The second floor became administrative space. The first floor galleries remained essentially as Adelaide had left them. The garden court became the central public space. Additional gallery space was created where possible without compromising the building's residential character. But the core experience would be walking through a home where extraordinary art happened to be displayed. The work took 4 years. The Frick collection opened to the public in December 1935. Admission was free initially, though reservations were required to control crowd size. The response exceeded expectations. Despite the Depression, despite Frick's controversial reputation, thousands wanted to see the collection and the mansion that housed it. The assassination attempt that had nearly killed Frick 43 years earlier was largely forgotten. The Homestead strike that had made him hated was historical footnote. What remained was the art and the architecture. The fortress he had built to protect himself had become something else entirely, a place where beauty was accessible to anyone who wanted to see it. Adelaide's choice to honor Henry's vision had preserved something that might otherwise have been lost. The mansion could have been demolished. The collection could have been scattered. Instead, Both survived together, exactly as Henry Clay Frick had planned. The woman who had lived alone in the fortress for 12 years had completed its transformation. From defense to legacy, from private hatred to public gift, the walls remained. Their purpose had changed. The fortress opens, 1935. The Frick Collection opened its doors on December 16, 1935. The timing was significant. America was 6 years into the Great Depression. Unemployment remained above 20%. Banks had failed. Fortunes had disappeared. And yet, thousands lined up to enter a mansion built by one of the men who had helped create the economic system that had collapsed. The contradiction was not lost on critics. Newspapers questioned whether celebrating robber baron wealth was appropriate when so many were struggling. Some called for the collection to be sold and the proceeds distributed to the poor. Others argued that preserving great art served everyone, regardless of how the money to buy it had been obtained. The trustees proceeded. The Frick Collection would open as planned. What visitors found was unlike any other museum in New York. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was encyclopedic, with hundreds of galleries spanning millennia. The Museum of Modern Art, which had opened in 1929, was challenging and avant-garde. The Frick Collection was something else entirely. Intimate, elegant, personal. You could see the entire collection in a single visit. The mansion's residential scale made great art accessible without intimidation. You walked through rooms where a family had actually lived. You sat on furniture they had used. You looked at paintings they had looked at every day. The garden court that Adelaide had commissioned became the emotional center of the experience. Visitors consistently described it as their favorite space. The combination of classical architecture, natural light, living plants, and the sound of water from the central fountain created an atmosphere unlike anything else in New York's museum landscape. This space had not existed when Frick lived in the house, but it perfectly captured what he had wanted the building to become. A place where beauty and permanence could coexist, where architecture enhanced art rather than competing with it. The first floor galleries revealed Hastings' genius. The rooms were proportioned for human comfort, not institutional monumentality. Ceilings were high enough to display large paintings, but not so high that viewers felt dwarfed. Natural light supplemented electric lighting. The effect was warmth rather than coldness. The West Gallery displayed some of Frick's finest acquisitions: Rembrandt, Vermeer, Velázquez, Van Dyck. These were paintings that could anchor entire museums. Here they hung in a room that felt like someone's home. The intimacy changed how you experienced them. The library retained its residential character: English oak paneling, painted ceiling panels, a marble fireplace, comfortable furniture. This was a room where Frick had actually worked and read. Now visitors could sit in the same space and understand how he had lived with his collection. The living hall combined Renaissance furniture, classical architecture, and carefully selected paintings into a space that balanced grandeur with approachability. An organ sat at one end, a reminder that this had been a place where the Frick family entertained guests and lived their daily lives. The dining room showed the table where the Fricks had eaten, the chairs Adelaide had commissioned, the paintings that had surrounded family meals. The domesticity was intentional. This was not a palace. This was a home that happened to contain masterpieces. The defensive features Frick had obsessed over were now serving their new purpose invisibly. The thick walls provided climate control that protected paintings. The bronze doors secured the collection against theft. The over-engineered structure meant the building could support the weight of visitors without stress. Security systems that might have stopped another assassination attempt now prevented damage to irreplaceable art. The fortress had become a vault, but for culture rather than for one man's protection. The irony was perfect and probably intentional. Frick had survived Alexander Berkman's bullets in 1892. He had spent the next 27 years building walls. Those walls, designed initially for defense, now welcomed the public he had spent his life keeping at a distance. The homestead workers who had died in 1892 were not mentioned in the museum's opening materials. The assassination attempt was not part of the official narrative. The Frick collection presented itself as a gift of beauty and culture, with no acknowledgement of the violence and brutality that had financed it. This selective memory troubled some observers. Others argued that great art transcends its origins. The debate continues today. What was undeniable was the building's success as a museum. Visitors came. They stayed longer than expected. They returned. The intimate scale and residential character that Adelaide and the trustees had worked to preserve made the Frick collection special in ways that larger, more traditional museums could not replicate. The mansion that Henry Clay Frick had designed to protect himself had become something he had planned but never fully imagined. A place where strangers walked through rooms he had defended, where the public accessed what he had kept private, where his name became associated with beauty rather than blood. Whether this represented redemption or merely the durability of great architecture was a question each visitor answered differently. The fortress had opened. What it meant remained ambiguous. By the end of 1936, the Frick collection had established itself as one of New York's essential cultural institutions. The mansion built by one of America's most hated men had become one of its most beloved museums. The assassination attempt that had nearly killed Frick 44 years earlier was forgotten by most visitors. They came for Vermeer and Rembrandt, not for industrial history. The building had accomplished exactly what Frick had designed it to accomplish. It had outlasted his reputation. The last fortress standing. Walk down Fifth Avenue today between 60th and 80th Streets. Look for the Gilded Age mansions that once lined both sides of the street. Most are gone. The William K. Vanderbilt mansion at 52nd Street was demolished in 1926. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion at 57th Street, the largest private residence ever built in New York City, came down in 1927. Just 40 years after construction, over 100 rooms reduced to rubble. The Astor mansions disappeared even earlier, consumed by commercial development creeping north from Midtown. The Havemeyer House, the Whitney Mansion, the Huntington Palace. Gone. All of them gone. The Frick collection remains, not converted to condominiums, not replaced by a glass tower. Still functioning exactly as Henry Clay Frick intended when he purchased the land in 1913. A public museum housed in a private mansion. The survival is remarkable when you understand what happened to comparable structures. The economic pressure to monetize Fifth Avenue real estate has been enormous for a century. The land where the Frick sits would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars if sold for development. Yet the building stands. What saved it was not sentiment or historic preservation laws. Those concepts barely existed when most mansions were demolished. The Frick survived because it had been designed from the beginning to serve a purpose beyond residential use. Museums are protected in ways private homes never can be. Nonprofit status provides tax advantages. Institutional purpose generates public support. Legal structures prevent sale or demolition. By converting to museum use, the mansion gained protections that saved it when economic pressures destroyed everything around it. But survival alone does not explain the Frick's importance. The building matters because it offers something increasingly rare, an authentic experience of Gilded Age residential architecture at the highest level. You can walk through rooms largely unchanged since 1919. You can see art displayed in the domestic setting for which it was acquired. You can understand how wealth and culture intersected in an era when private individuals could assemble collections that rivaled national institutions. The Frick collection now attracts over 300,000 visitors annually. They come from around the world to see the paintings, Vermeer's Mistress and Maid, Rembrandt's Polish Rider, Bellini's St. Francis in the Desert. These are works that define Western art history. But visitors also come for the building itself. The mansion teaches architectural history in ways lectures cannot. You understand Beaux-Arts design by standing in spaces Thomas Hastings created. You comprehend domestic scale by moving through rooms proportioned for human comfort, rather than institutional monumentality. The garden court that John Russell Pope designed has become the signature space. The sound of water from the central fountain, natural light filtering through the glass roof, classical columns framing views of plants that change with seasons. Visitors consistently describe it as transformative. This space did not exist when Frick lived in the house. Adelaide commissioned it years after his death. Yet it perfectly captures what he wanted the mansion to become: a place where architecture and art enhance each other, where beauty serves a purpose beyond private enjoyment. The collection has grown since Adelaide's death. Subsequent acquisitions have added works that complement the original holdings. But the core remains Henry Clay Frick's personal choices. The paintings he selected, the furniture he used, the rooms he designed. This personal dimension gives the collection a coherence that encyclopedic museums cannot achieve. In 2011, the Frick began planning a major expansion. The project, designed by Seldorf architects, would add gallery space, improve visitor facilities, and address infrastructure needs that had become critical after decades of use. The expansion has been controversial. Preservationists argue that any change threatens the mansion's character. Museum leadership insists that institutions must evolve to survive. The debate reflects a fundamental tension in the Frick's identity. Is it primarily a historic house that happens to contain art, or primarily an art museum that happens to occupy a historic house? The answer shapes every decision about the building's future. But even with planned expansions, the core of the institution remains the mansion. The rooms Hastings designed, the spaces where the Frick family lived, the galleries Henry Clay Frick created for his collection. That foundation is irreplaceable. The comparison that matters most is with the Vanderbilt houses that once dominated Fifth Avenue. The Vanderbilts built for themselves. Spectacular displays of wealth meant to impress contemporaries. When those contemporaries died and tastes changed, the houses became obsolete. Frick built for centuries. He designed a residence that could transform into an institution. He chose classical architecture that would not date. He created galleries that could function as museum spaces with minimal modification. The Vanderbilts maximized present impact. Frick planned for permanent legacy. The difference determined which buildings survived. There is brutal accounting that cannot be ignored. The mansion was financed by money extracted from workers whose names we will never know. The elegance of its proportions and the quality of its collection do not erase that history. They coexist with it. The homestead workers who died in 1892 made this building possible. The union wages Frick eliminated became marble floors and mahogany paneling. The pensions never paid became art galleries and formal gardens. This is not metaphor. This is fact. Frick understood this. He simply did not care. The world belonged to men who could take it and hold it. Buildings proved you could do both. The question visitors must answer for themselves is whether great beauty justifies brutal origins, whether we can separate art from the violence that financed it, whether institutions built on blood money become something else when open to the public. The Frick collection exists in that moral complexity. It offers no easy answers. It presents beauty without apology, and history without complete honesty. The mansion is both a gift and a monument to inequality. What makes the Frick remarkable is not that it survived when others fell. What makes it remarkable is that Henry Clay Frick predicted that survival and designed for it deliberately. He understood something his contemporaries missed. Private excess becomes obsolete. Public institutions endure. If you want your name to last, build something that serves a purpose beyond yourself. The assassination attempt in 1892 taught Frick that he was mortal. The mansion at 1 East 70th Street proved that his buildings were not. Alexander Berkman failed to kill Henry Clay Frick with bullets and a knife. But in a way, the attack succeeded in creating something neither man intended. A fortress so beautiful that people would forget it was a fortress. A defense so elegant that it became a gift. A man so hated that he built monuments to outlast hatred itself. The Frick collection stands today as evidence that architecture can rewrite history. Not completely, not honestly, but effectively enough that millions walk through doors designed to keep them out, grateful for the privilege. Whether that represents Frick's victory, or merely the durability of great architecture, depends on what you believe about art and memory, and the price we are willing to pay for beauty. The fortress opened. The question of what it means remains unanswered. 3 mansions, 1 assassination attempt, and a legacy built on blood that became something else entirely. Clayton and Pittsburgh taught Henry Clay Frick how to build defensively. Thick walls, strategic windows, architecture that announced he could not be broken. The house stood as his answer to Homestead and everything that followed. Eagle Rock in Newport taught him that distance provided better protection than fortification. 10 acres of buffer zones, landscape as surveillance. Security so sophisticated it appeared to be nothing more than elegant design. 1 East 70th Street in New York taught the world that buildings outlast reputations. That stone endures when memory fades. That a man hated enough to be shot and stabbed in his own office could be remembered instead for the beauty he collected and the spaces he created to display it. The transformation is not redemption. Frick never apologized for Homestead, never expressed regret for the workers who died or the families destroyed. He simply built something so permanent and so beautiful that eventually most people forgot why they had hated him. The Frick collection exists today because Alexander Berkman walked into an office in July 1892 with a gun and a knife. That violence created a man obsessed with permanence, with walls that could not be breached, with buildings that would stand after everyone who remembered his crimes was gone. He succeeded. The mansion stands. The collection endures. And millions have experienced great art in perfect rooms without knowing the names of the men who died at Homestead to make those rooms possible. This is not a story with a moral conclusion. This is a story about what survives and what does not. About how wealth and violence can be transformed into culture and beauty. About whether any of that transformation matters, or whether it simply proves that enough money and enough time can erase almost anything. The fortress Henry Clay Frick built to protect himself from the consequences of his own brutality has become one of America's most beloved cultural institutions. Whether that represents triumph or tragedy depends on what you value more, the art on the walls or the blood in the foundation. Both are real, both are permanent, and both are part of the story that the mansion at 1 East 70th Street will tell for as long as it stands.